Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal and often underestimated conflicts of the modern era, the Russo-Japanese War. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, a war between Russia and Japan over 100 years ago? Why should I care? Well, buckle in, because this war did far more than shuffle a few borders. It shocked the world, cracked the myth of Western invincibility, and flipped the script on global power in ways that still echo today. But before we charge into the battlefield, we need to set the stage. This wasn't just a random scuffle, it was the result of decades of tension, ambition, and transformation. Let's break it down. First, Japan's post-Meiji modernization. After centuries of isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan opened up to the outside world in the mid-1800s, and by 1868, the Meiji Restoration launched the country into a period of rapid industrialization and reform. Factories, railroads, modern weaponry, Japan embraced Western technology and political systems with almost dizzying speed. And it wasn't just about catching up, it was about stepping into the ring with the great powers of the world. By the early 1900s, Japan wasn't just modern, it was a rising contender. On the other side of this growing rivalry was Russia, expanding aggressively eastward. Russian expansion was about more than just land, it was about power projection. Tsarist Russia wanted control over Korea and Manchuria, territories that were seen as keys to influence in the Pacific. Manchuria offered natural resources and strategic railways, while Korea was viewed as a gateway to both military dominance and economic opportunity. And when two rising powers both want the same real estate, well, you can imagine what happens next. Now, add in the great power rivalries of the time. This was the age of empire. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, they were all scrambling for influence across Asia. The Boxer Rebellion in China had just wrapped up, leaving a power vacuum and lots of nervous foreign diplomats. The tension was thick, everyone had their eyes on Asia, and everyone had their own agenda. Finally, we come to the strategic hotspots, specifically, Korea and Manchuria. These weren't just names on a map. These were economic goldmines and military choke points. Whoever controlled them would dominate East Asia. So while it may have looked like a regional spat, this conflict had global implications from the very start. And that, my friends, is how we set the stage for war: two ambitious empires, one volatile region, and a whole lot of global eyes watching what would come next. Alright, now that we've set the scene, let's move into why this war truly mattered on the world stage. So, why did this war matter to the rest of the world? I mean, Japan and Russia going head-to-head might sound like just another territorial dispute, right? But no, this was a thunderclap heard around the globe. Let's unpack just how deep the shockwaves went. First off, this was the first Asian victory over a European power in modern warfare. That might not sound like much now, but at the time, it shattered the long-standing myth that Western nations were militarily unbeatable. You see, for centuries, European powers had marched into other continents with an air of superiority, assuming their technology, tactics, and sheer size would guarantee victory. Japan flipped that on its head. With discipline, strategy, and homegrown modernization, they not only challenged a European empire, they beat it. On land and at sea, it was like watching the underdog knock out the heavyweight champion in the first round. Now let's talk about the racial and imperial ideology shock. In the early 20th century, the world was still deeply entrenched in colonial thinking, this idea that Western nations were inherently superior, both racially and culturally. Japan's victory humiliated that worldview. It showed that a non-Western nation could match, even outperform, a European power using modern methods. For the imperialists in London, Paris, and Washington, it was more than a military defeat, it was a psychological crisis. That leads us to fuel for anti-colonial movements. All across Asia and Africa, colonized peoples were watching. Nationalists, reformers, and revolutionaries saw Japan's triumph as proof that imperial rule wasn't destiny, it was a challenge to be overcome. If Japan could assert its sovereignty and win, why not them? The victory didn't just shake Europe's confidence, it lit a spark in the hearts of those fighting for freedom. And finally, the birth of a military power. This wasn't just Japan flexing once and calling it a day. The war marked its arrival as a major military force in the region. Japan had joined the club, and not just as a guest. This was the moment the world realized that Japan wasn't content to be a student of Western tactics. It wanted a seat at the table, and maybe, just maybe, it was ready to flip that table over if necessary. So globally, the Russo-Japanese War wasn't a sideshow, it was a signal, a sign that the old order was crumbling, and new powers were rising fast. Ready for battle? In the next part, we'll break down the major strategies and show you exactly how Japan pulled this off. Alright, so we know Japan shocked the world by defeating a European power, but let's not just talk outcomes. Let's look at the how. How did Japan pull off this upset? What strategies turned the tide? It's time to dive into the actual battles and bold moves that defined the war. Let's start with the surprise attack on Port Arthur. Now picture this, it's February of 1904. Japan hasn't even officially declared war yet, and boom, they launch a sudden naval strike on the Russian fleet stationed at Port Arthur, a heavily fortified base in Manchuria. This move stunned the Russians and the world. It was precise, it was devastating, and it caught Russia totally off guard. Japan wasn't waiting for formality, it was sending a message. This wasn't going to be a slow chess match. It was going to be fast, calculated, and ruthless. Some historians even call it a dress rehearsal for Pearl Harbor decades later. Next, we move to the Battle of Mukden. This was the largest land battle of the entire war, and at the time, one of the biggest in history. We're talking over 600,000 troops clashing across icy terrain in northeastern China. For 3 weeks, the Japanese and Russian armies slugged it out in brutal conditions. And against all odds, Japan emerged victorious again. This wasn't just another win, it showed that Japan could go toe-to-toe with a massive, industrialized European army on land, not just at sea. And then, yes, the Battle of Tsushima. This one is legendary. In 1905, Russia's Baltic Fleet, after a grueling 18,000-mile journey around the world, finally reached East Asian waters. The plan? Reinforce Russia's struggling naval presence. The result? A complete disaster. The Japanese Navy, led by Admiral Togo, ambushed the fleet in the Tsushima Strait and annihilated it. It wasn't even close. Over 30 Russian ships were sunk or captured, while Japan lost only a handful. This was a decisive, almost cinematic victory, one of the most crushing naval defeats in modern history. But Japan didn't just win battles, they fought smart. Their success came from a combined arms strategy. That means they didn't think of land and sea battles as separate, they coordinated them. Naval power softened enemy positions, cut off reinforcements, and secured supply lines while ground forces moved in with precision. This was modern military doctrine in action, and Japan used it with discipline and innovation. So by the end of these engagements, Japan wasn't just winning, it was redefining how modern wars could be fought, quick, coordinated, and with a flair for surprise. Next up, we'll take a look at the people behind these decisions, the key figures who shaped this war from the throne rooms to the battlefield. Now let's put some faces to this drama, because behind every great war are the individuals pulling the strings, making the calls, and shaping the course of history. This conflict wasn't just about armies and maps, it was about people, visionaries, tacticians, and, yes, a few tragic miscalculators. We begin with Emperor Meiji, the symbolic heart of Japan's transformation. He wasn't on the front lines swinging a sword, but make no mistake, his presence was pivotal. Emperor Meiji represented a new Japan, unified, industrialized, and hungry for recognition. Under his reign, Japan threw off centuries of feudal isolation and dove headfirst into modernity. Railroads, conscription, a national army, it all came together during his rule. By the time the war began, the Japanese public saw him not just as a monarch, but as the embodiment of national pride. His image rallied the people, legitimized the military effort, and gave the entire campaign a sense of destiny. Then we've got Admiral Togo Heihachiro. Now this guy? A legend. The strategic mastermind behind Japan's stunning naval victories, especially the Battle of Tsushima. Think of him as Japan's version of Horatio Nelson or Admiral Nimitz. He had nerves of steel and an eye for opportunity. Togo didn't just follow the rules of naval warfare, he rewrote them. His tactics were bold but calculated, and his ability to adapt to the flow of battle made him a national hero almost overnight. He wasn't just commanding ships, he was steering the future of Japan's empire. Across the battlefield stood Tsar Nicholas II. And well, let's just say his war record isn't exactly sparkling. Nicholas oversaw one of the most embarrassing defeats in Russian history. His leadership was marked by indecision, poor intelligence, and growing unrest back home. He underestimated Japan, overestimated his own generals, and by the time he realized the scale of the disaster, it was too late. This wasn't just a foreign policy blunder, it helped spark revolutionary flames that would eventually consume his entire dynasty. Ouch! Finally, we have what I like to call the iconic perspectives, figures who weren't commanders or emperors, but who saw this war as a turning point for the world. One of the most notable was W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American intellectual and civil rights leader. He viewed Japan's victory as a racial and global milestone, a crack in the wall of white supremacy that had dominated world affairs. For many in colonized nations, the Russo-Japanese War wasn't just geopolitics, it was proof that the empire could bleed. So, there you have it. Power, pride, and perspective, all embodied in the people who lived it. And speaking of consequences, next we're going to see just how the rest of the world reacted when the dust settled and the war was finally over. Alright, the war is over. Japan stands victorious. Russia is humiliated. But the story doesn't end there, not even close. The global reaction to this war was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread everywhere. Let's take a look at what followed. First, Russia's internal instability. You might remember that Russia was already sitting on a keg of discontent before the war began: economic struggles, class divisions, and a growing revolutionary movement. Well, the war poured gasoline on all of it. Losing to Japan wasn't just a military failure, it was a national embarrassment. People were furious, and that fury erupted in the Revolution of 1905. Strikes, protests, mutinies, it all boiled over. The Tsar was forced to make concessions, like creating the Duma, a legislative assembly, but the damage was done. The seeds of revolution had sprouted, and the system would never quite recover. Meanwhile, Japan's victory sparked a surge in nationalism and confidence. This was more than just a military win, it was a cultural awakening. Japan now saw itself not only as an equal to the Western powers, but as a leader in Asia. This confidence fueled its ambitions moving forward, both diplomatically and militarily. The victory gave Japan leverage in future negotiations and shaped its foreign policy for decades. It also planted the early seeds of imperial expansion, which would come into play in future conflicts. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end peacefully. Then there's the impact on European powers. Across Europe, heads of state and military planners were suddenly sweating. They realized they could no longer assume technological superiority would guarantee victory, especially over newly industrialized nations. It shook up diplomatic alliances and forced a rethink in colonial strategy. The balance of power was starting to shift, and fast, and this all led to a re-evaluation of colonial rule. In colonies around the world, the Russo-Japanese War became a symbol, a proof of concept. Independence movements gained inspiration and momentum. If Japan could rise, so could India, so could Vietnam, so could Egypt. The idea that Western rule was somehow natural or permanent suddenly didn't seem so convincing. The cracks in the colonial facade were beginning to show. So globally, this wasn't just a war. It was a spark. One that lit fires in palaces and village huts alike. One that challenged the order of the world and gave voice to those long kept silent. Next up, we're going to take a step back and ask the big question: what legacy did this war really leave behind? Now let's zoom out and ask the big picture question: what is the legacy of the Russo-Japanese War? Because it wasn't just about who won or who lost, it was about how the world changed in its aftermath. First, it was a turning point in global power dynamics. Before this war, the global order looked like a European monopoly. Britain, France, Germany, and Russia were seen as the uncontested giants of the world stage. But this war cracked that illusion. Japan's rise marked the beginning of a multipolar world. It showed that new powers could emerge, especially if they embraced modernization and strategy over brute imperial force. This was one of the earliest signs that the old colonial era was entering its twilight. Next, let's talk about lessons in modern warfare. The Russo-Japanese War was a preview of what would come in the brutal years ahead. Trench warfare, mass casualties, coordinated land-sea operations, all of it foreshadowed the horrors of World War I. Military thinkers across the globe took notes. Unfortunately, many of them took the wrong ones. They saw the glory, not the cost. But the techniques pioneered here, especially Japan's coordination and logistics, would go on to shape the playbook of 20th century warfare. Then we have inspiration for future movements. This war became a symbol of resistance and potential. Revolutionaries, nationalists, and independence leaders around the world looked to Japan as proof that power could be challenged and that the so-called natural order was anything but. It inspired hope, and sometimes, it inspired fear. It all depended on which side of the empire you were standing on. And finally, a foreshadowing of future conflicts. Japan didn't stop after this. The war planted the seeds of expansionism, militarism, and growing ambition that would eventually lead to its involvement in World War II. Russia, on the other hand, spiraled into further unrest, setting the stage for revolution in 1917. So in a way, this war was a rehearsal for the chaos that would define the next for decades. So, what are we left with? A war that most people barely remember, but one that reshaped the world in ways we're still feeling today. It challenged empires, empowered nations, and proved that history doesn't always follow the script. If you found this fascinating, you're in luck. There's a lot more where that came from. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy deep dives into the real turning points of our past. And if you want more forgotten wars, shocking revolutions, or world-shaping moments, go check out my other videos here on Truth Behind History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the stories are real, and the impact is lasting.